What does it mean when the United States hits Iran for the 10th night in a row? And why does the most dangerous part of this story begin only after the bombs stop falling? If you want clear, no-nonsense updates on this story, hit like, subscribe, and share this video with one person who actually cares about world events. By now, a lot of people have heard the headline and moved on. Another night of strikes, another round of statements, another wave of fear in the Middle East. But this is not just another night. 10 straight nights of American strikes on Iranian targets means something much bigger than a single retaliation. It means the conflict has moved from reaction to strategy. It means the White House is no longer sending a warning shot. It is building pressure. And when pressure builds this long, something has to give. Some viewers hear that and think only about bombs. But the real story is the shape of the campaign, the timing, the order of the targets, the way each strike seems to open the door for the next one. That is why Night 10 matters so much. It is not just the latest blast in the sky. It is the point where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. If the first few nights were about sending a message, the 10th night is about forcing a decision. And that is why people are speaking about this as Trump's revenge. Not because revenge is a clean word or a noble one, but because it captures the mood. Iran spent years testing limits, pushing proxies, and assuming the United States would eventually blink. Trump is now betting that the opposite is true. He is betting that if America keeps striking long enough, Iran will run out of room, run out of time, and run out of easy answers. To understand why this is so serious, you have to remember one simple fact. Iran is not just a country with a military. It is a system built around layers of defense, layers of control, and layers of response. It does not rely on one base, one commander, or one missile site. It spreads power out so that no single blow can bring the whole machine down. For years, that spread gave Iran confidence. It believed distance, geography, and complexity would protect it. That belief is now being tested in the harshest way possible. 10 nights of strikes suggest that the U.S. did not enter this fight with a random list of targets. It entered with a map. Each night appears to have removed one more shield. First, the radar, then the command links, then the air defense pieces that tell the rest of the system where danger is coming from, then the deeper support sites, then the hidden reserves. By the time the 10th night arrived, the easy targets were gone. What was left were the places Iran hoped nobody could reach. That is why this story feels different from the usual Middle East flare-up. Most crises explode fast, then cool off, then come back later in a different form. This one is unfolding like a tightening rope. Every night closes another gap. Every strike narrows the next move. And every public statement from Tehran sounds a little more strained, a little more defensive, and a little less certain than the last. If you are wondering why the world should care, the answer is simple. Because once a conflict reaches this stage, the question is no longer whether one side can hit the other. The question is whether either side still has a safe off-ramp. Right now, that off-ramp looks smaller by the hour. The United States does not launch 10 nights of strikes unless it believes something larger is at stake. That could be deterrence. It could be punishment. It could be a message to Iran, but also to every ally, proxy, and rival watching from the sidelines. The signal is not subtle. America is telling the region that it is willing to stay in the fight, not just flare up and leave. For Trump, that matters politically as well as militarily. He has always sold himself as the man who does not like endless wars, but he has also built his image around strength. He wants to look unpredictable in the way that scares enemies and reassures supporters. He wants Tehran to believe that every option now costs more than it used to. He wants the world to think that the old pattern, where Iran could absorb a hit and wait for the next administration, no longer works. That is the deeper tension here. Is this a limited campaign designed to break Iran's ability to threaten the Gulf? Or is it the opening chapter of something much bigger? The answer matters, because the line between punishment and escalation is getting thinner each day. When strikes continue this long, they stop being a moment and start becoming a policy. And once a policy is in motion, both sides begin making decisions based on fear of what the other side might do next. That is how crises grow, not always through one giant mistake, but through a chain of small choices that slowly close the door behind everyone. Night 10 also matters because of where the bombs reportedly landed. Early reports suggest the strikes reached deeper into Iranian territory than the earlier waves. Not just obvious military sites near the west or center of the country, but remote storage and logistics areas that were built for survival. These are the kinds of places governments use when they expect war. They hide important equipment far from the places people usually look. That makes this far more than damage to buildings. It means the U.S. is no longer only targeting the visible muscle. It is going after the hidden bones of the system, the places that feed the front line, the places that keep missiles, drones, spare parts, and command support alive after the first round of attacks. If those areas are being hit, Iran's ability to recover gets weaker with every passing night. That is what makes military planners so interested in timing. The later strikes are not just more violence. They are the result of earlier violence. If the first wave takes down enough protection, the second wave can go deeper. If the second wave goes deeper, the third can hit things that were once untouchable. That is how a campaign becomes a ladder. And the 10th night suggests that ladder is not accidental. It suggests someone planned to peel Iran open one layer at a time. That is a cold sentence, but it is the right one, because the method matters. A strike campaign is not just about what is destroyed, it is about what is left exposed. On night 10, what was exposed was Iran's belief that some parts of its system were too deep to be reached. This is also why the Iranian response has looked so tense. In public, officials try to sound calm. They promise revenge. They promise resilience. They promise that the Islamic Republic will not bend. But behind those words, there are signs of strain that are hard to hide. One of the clearest signs is leadership pressure. When a military command begins shifting during an active strike campaign, that is not normal business. That is crisis management. It means someone in Tehran believes the current chain of command is not producing the results it needs. It means blame is moving upward. It means people close to power are asking who failed, who misjudged, and who should take the risk of making the next decision. And that kind of shakeup changes everything. Armies do not like to fight while reorganizing themselves. Orders get slower, trust gets weaker. Senior officers spend more time protecting their positions and less time thinking clearly about the enemy. If reports are right that Iran has had to reshuffle key military figures while under fire, that tells you the pressure is not just physical, it is psychological. It also tells you something about fear inside the system. Authoritarian governments often look strongest when they are least stable, because they hide doubt behind ceremony. But no amount of ceremony can hide the fact that a military leadership change in the middle of 10 straight nights of strikes means the people at the top are worried. Not a little worried. Deeply worried. There is another layer to this that should make everyone pay attention. Iran does not just fear the US bombs. It fears what happens when the bombs change the balance of the region. That is why the Strait of Hormuz keeps coming back into the conversation. The strait is not just a narrow waterway. It is one of the most important pressure points on Earth. A huge share of the world's oil supply moves through that channel. So, when Iranian naval forces shift position, when fast boats move, when submarines are reported nearby, and when anti-ship systems are placed on alert, the market reacts immediately. It does not wait for mines to be laid. It reacts to the possibility that they could be. That is why insurance costs jump. That is why tankers slow down. That is why traders start acting nervous before governments even release formal statements. In global finance, fear is often faster than facts. The moment a real threat to shipping appears, oil prices spike because the world knows what disruption looks like. It looks like longer routes, delayed deliveries, higher costs, and panic in countries that depend on imported energy. This is where a regional war becomes a global problem. People far from Iran do not need to hear a missile launch to feel the shock. They feel it in fuel prices, airline costs, shipping bills, and inflation. The conflict may be local on a map, but it is not local in effect. That is why every move near the Strait of Hormuz carries so much weight. One wrong move there and the whole world gets a bill. And then there is Iraq, which may be the most overlooked part of this story. While the headlines focus on Iranian soil and American air power, Baghdad has been forced into a dangerous political position. If Iraq asks U.S. forces to leave, that is not just a diplomatic gesture. It is a sign that the regional balance is cracking. Why does that matter? Because Iraq sits in the middle of so many tensions. It is where American troops, Iranian influence, local militias, and fragile state power all collide. When Baghdad feels pressure intense enough to demand a withdrawal, it shows how quickly this conflict spills across borders. It also shows how hard it is for regional leaders to keep pretending they can stand between Washington and Tehran forever. For years, Iraq has tried to survive by balancing both sides. That balance is now under real strain. If American strikes keep going, Iraqi leaders will face more domestic anger, more militia pressure, and more fear that their country is being dragged into a war it did not choose. That is a recipe for political fracture. And that fracture matters to Trump's strategy, because no U.S. president wants to look weak in the middle of a campaign, but no president wants to lose basing rights, regional partners, or coalition support either. This is where military action and diplomacy begin fighting each other. The more force is used, the harder it becomes to keep the regional network together. The more the network breaks, the more dangerous the entire campaign becomes. If you zoom out far enough, you can see the basic shape of what may be happening. This does not look like a series of disconnected strikes. It looks like a deliberate exhaustion strategy. That means the goal is not simply to punish Iran once. The goal is to wear down its ability to respond at all. First, you force its defenses to work overtime. Then you chip away at the command network. Then you make it harder to move equipment. Then you hit the deeper reserves. Then you force Tehran to make decisions while exhausted, embarrassed, and uncertain. That is a brutal, kind of strategy because it is built on psychology as much as firepower. It is not only about destroying objects, it is about making the other side doubt its own control. When a government begins to doubt its control, even strong weapons become harder to use well. A missile battery that cannot coordinate is less useful. A proxy network that cannot receive clear orders is less useful. A military that is always reacting is always behind. This is where people miss the real meaning of long campaigns. 1 strike can shock, 10 strikes can reshape behavior. That is the hope, anyway, from Washington's point of view. But exhaustion cuts both ways. It can force surrender, or it can force rage. And rage in a place like this can be terribly expensive, so yes, there may be a method behind the strikes. But a method is not the same thing as a guarantee. A plan can be elegant and still fail if the enemy decides survival matters more than caution. Every military campaign tells a story through repetition. Night 1 says, who can still see? Night 2 says, who can still move? Night 3 says, who can still command? By night 10, the story is not about pain anymore. It is about whether the target believes tomorrow is predictable. Once a state loses predictability, it loses confidence, and once it loses confidence, even a strong army starts acting weaker than it is. That is why the 10th night matters so much. It is not the biggest explosion. It is the clearest proof that the pressure has been systematic. For Iran, that creates a terrible choice. If it responds too softly, it looks weak at home and invites more pressure. If it responds too hard, it risks giving Washington the justification for a wider campaign. For Iran, that creates a terrible choice. If it responds too softly, it looks weak at home and invites more pressure. If it responds too hard, it risks giving Washington the justification for a wider campaign. That is the trap. No matter what Tehran does, someone inside the system will call it a mistake. Hardliners want resistance. Pragmatists want survival. The problem is that under constant attack, those two ideas stop living in the same room. Iran still has options. The problem is that each option is weaker than it was at the start of this crisis. The first option is direct retaliation. Iran can try to fire missiles at American positions or at Israeli targets, but if its launch infrastructure has been damaged, and if its mobile launchers have been hunted down, then that response, or at Israeli targets. But if its launch infrastructure has been damaged, and if its mobile launchers have been hunted down, then that response becomes harder to coordinate and easier to intercept. A noisy retaliation may satisfy public anger, but it may not change the strategic balance. The second option is proxy warfare. That means pushing allied groups in Lebanon, Iraq, Syria, or Yemen to do the work indirectly. But proxy warfare depends on communication, timing, and trust. When command networks are disrupted, the whole system becomes slower and messier. Proxies can still hurt people, and they absolutely can still create chaos, but they may not be able to deliver synchronized pressure. And messier. Proxies can still hurt people, and they absolutely can still create chaos, but they may not be able to deliver synchronized pressure. The third option is the Strait of Hormuz. That is the nightmare scenario for global markets. Even the hint of serious disruption can send prices soaring, but this option also carries huge risks for Iran. If it turns the strait into a battlefield, it invites an even harder U.S. response. The fourth option is the nuclear card. Not a bomb, but the threat of moving faster, hiding more, or changing legal commitments. That card is powerful because it changes how everyone else thinks. But it is also dangerous because once that language enters the conversation, the crisis starts becoming about the future of the non-proliferation system. There is a reason every capital around the Gulf is watching with dread. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, and Oman all know that a serious disruption in Hormuz would not stay a military problem. It would become a budget problem, a trade problem, and a political problem overnight. It would force emergency meetings, new security plans, and new pressure from Washington and Tehran at the same time. Nobody wants to pick a side, but in a crisis like this, even silence can look like a choice. That is, it would force emergency meetings, new security plans, and new pressure from Washington and Tehran at the same time. Nobody wants to pick a side, but in a crisis like this, even silence can look like a choice. That is why the 10th night feels like a threshold. Not because the explosions were louder, but because the meaning of the campaign is harder to deny. If you are a military planner, the dream is simple. You want to strike in a way that creates a chain reaction. You want one night to make the next night easier until the enemy's defenses are so weakened that the deepest sights are no longer safe. That is what a professional campaign looks like. It is not random. It is layered. It is patient. It is designed to deny the opponent a clean response. And if that is what the U.S. has done, then Trump's team is sending a very clear message. This is not about one incident. It is about breaking the idea that Iran can absorb pressure forever. The old playbook was built on the belief that Washington would lose interest. But 10 nights in a row says the opposite. It says the U.S. is prepared to keep the pressure on until one side breaks, blinks, or bargains. That raises the hardest question of all. What does Trump actually want? If he wants simple revenge, the danger is that revenge never feels complete. Each hit creates the temptation for another. If he wants leverage, if he wants simple revenge, the danger is that revenge never feels complete. Each hit creates the temptation for another. If he wants leverage, then the strikes have to be strong enough to scare Tehran, but not so strong that talks become impossible. And if he wants to reshape the region, then he is walking into a much larger and much less predictable fight. That is the trap. A campaign can begin with a clean idea and end inside a mess no one fully controls. The human side of this is easy to forget when the language gets technical. People hear about defenses, launchers, and shipping lanes, but behind those words are real lives. Families near military sites, workers in ports, sailors on tankers. To forget when the language gets technical. People hear about defenses, launchers, and shipping lanes, but behind those words are real lives. Families near military sites, workers in ports, sailors on tankers. Parents in cities who wake up and wonder if tonight is the night. That is the part of this crisis that does not show up in official language. It shows up in the silence after an explosion. It shows up in the fear of ordinary people who have no say in whether a strike happens, but pay anyway. And fear changes behavior. People withdraw cash. They rush fuel. They stock food. They try to leave dangerous areas. Companies delay investment. Airlines reroute. Port operators slow down. Every layer of society begins to react to the possibility that tomorrow could be worse than today. This matters because wars are not only fought by armies. They're absorbed by civilians who are trying to live normal lives while the world changes. That is why these 10 nights are so important. They are not only testing Iran's military, they are testing the patience and stability of a region. When people talk about revenge, they imagine a satisfying ending. In real life, revenge is usually just the start of more pain, and that is why the next few days matter so much. The 10th night may have been the planned end of one phase, or it may have been the moment. In real life, revenge is usually just the start of more pain. And that is why the next few days matter so much. The 10th night may have been the planned end of one phase, or it may have been the moment the entire crisis changed shape. That difference will only become clear if we watch what happens next, not just what was hit last night. There are really 3 paths. The first is that both sides step back, claim success, and let the crisis cool without saying it out loud. And the second path is a broader exchange. More strikes, more missile fire, more proxy attacks, more pressure on shipping, more public threats. This path is dangerous because every move creates pressure for the next. The third path is the one nobody wants to see. A mistake, a misread signal. This path is dangerous because every move creates pressure for the next. The third path is the one nobody wants to see. A mistake, a misread signal. One launch that goes farther than intended. One ship hit in the wrong place. One commander who thinks he has permission when he does not. That is how big wars begin. Not always with a plan, but sometimes with confusion. And this is why the next 24 to 72 hours matter so much. The world is now in that narrow space where every move says too much, and every pause says even more. If you have watched this far, you clearly want the full picture, not just the headline. Hit share, turn on notifications, and keep this video saved for the next update. You clearly want the full picture, not just the headline. Hit share, turn on notifications, keep this video saved for the next update. There's one more thing to keep in mind. Military power can destroy targets, but it cannot by itself create trust or erase humiliation. If Iran believes it is being boxed in, it may choose a response that is less about winning and more about proving it still matters. That is when leaders make the most dangerous choices. Not when they feel strong, but when they feel cornered. Trump knows that. Iran knows that. Which means everyone is now trying to manage everyone else's fear. That is a terrible way to run a crisis, because fear leaks into markets and alliances. It makes allies nervous and enemies reckless. It makes neutral countries hedge. Every side starts reading the room instead of facts. That is why the 10th night is more than a military event. It is a signal. The message is simple. The United States is willing to keep the heat on. Trump is willing to own the confrontation. Tehran has to decide if it can absorb another round without losing control of the larger story. That decision may not be public. It may show up in movements we see and the tone of statements that come out of Tehran before sunrise. If this sounds dangerous, that is because it is. There's a thin line between coercion and catastrophe. A thin line between a message and a war. A thin line between looking decisive and losing control of the fire. The 10th night proves the U.S. can reach deep. It proves Iran can respond. Both sides are trapped in a contest of nerves. Each wants the other to hesitate first. The risk is assuming the other side will stop. History is full of moments like this. Leaders think they manage a crisis until the crisis begins managing them. They think moves will be limited. Then the next move changes everything. They discover the other side has its own red lines, its own pride, and its own reasons to keep going. Stay alert. Not because panic helps, but because the future can tilt fast. By the time most people notice, the tilt has already happened. The 10th night is not just another strike. It is a more deliberate phase. If Trump's move was meant to force a back down, the next choice will tell us if it worked. If it was meant to break confidence, the response will show the result. If it was meant to open a door, both sides are there. This is about the limits of power. It is about how far a country can push before the cost of restraint is too high. It is about diplomacy. For now, the bombs have stopped. But the story has not. The silence after the 10th night is not peace. It is the breath before the next decision. And in this conflict, the next decision may matter more than all 10 nights combined.